September 1944. A cotton field outside Brenham, Texas. The heat shimmered above rows that stretched to the horizon as a German prisoner named Klaus Bauer bent low to pull weeds alongside 24 other captured soldiers from the Afrika Korps. The guards watched from the shade of a water truck while American farmhands operated machinery in adjacent fields. Bauer had driven half tracks across North Africa, maintained Panzer engines, and understood the weight and cost of military hardware. But when the farmer's teenage son rolled past on a John Deere Model D tractor, Bauer stopped working. The machine was massive, over 5,000 pounds of cast iron, steel wheels taller than a man, an engine block the size of an artillery piece. The boy guided it effortlessly across the field, pulling a four-bottom plow that turned earth faster than 20 men with hand tools. Bauer asked the guard what such a machine cost. The answer stunned him. More than a German officer earned in 10 years. And this was a standard farm tractor, not military equipment. It was just one of 15 million mechanized farm machines operating across America, feeding a nation while its factories built tanks. The German prisoners were witnessing an industrial capacity that rendered their homeland's war effort mathematically impossible. What these prisoners did not yet understand was that American agriculture had become a weapon of war, one that fed millions while simultaneously building the world's most powerful military machine. The mathematics of defeat were written not in battle losses, but in bushels per acre, horsepower per farmer, and the mechanical advantage of a nation that could afford to make its farmland a factory floor. Chapter 1. From Battlefield to Farmland. The crisis had begun quietly in the spring of 1942, when 2 million American men left their farms for military service and war industries. By harvest season, wheat rotted in Kansas fields. Potatoes sat unpicked in Idaho. Sugar beets withered in Nebraska. County agents received desperate calls from farmers who faced financial ruin without the hands to bring in crops that fed a nation at war. The United States Department of Agriculture watched production forecasts collapse while military demand soared. Something had to give. In April 1943, the War Department made a decision that would have seemed impossible 18 months earlier. German and Italian prisoners of war, captured by the tens of thousands in North Africa and Sicily, would be transported across the Atlantic and dispersed to camps throughout rural America. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be assigned to work only if they received fair wages and humane treatment. Officers could not be compelled to labor. The men would be paid 80 cents per day in camp coupons, redeemable at canteens for cigarettes, soap, and candy. Farmers would contact county agents to request workers, certifying that no other labor was available, then pay the government 40 to 50 cents per hour per prisoner. The first groups arrived in July 1943. 10 prisoners and 1 guard per farm, provided the farmer lived within 25 miles of a camp and could guarantee work for all 10. The restrictions loosened quickly as the labor crisis deepened. Remote satellite camps opened across the heartland. German soldiers who had fought in the desert now rode in trucks through Iowa cornfields and Texas cotton rows. They wore blue denim fatigues with the letters PW stenciled in white on their backs and legs. They were the enemy, and they were going to save the harvest. For the prisoners, the transition was disorienting. Klaus Bauer had commanded a half-track crew in Tunisia, navigating minefields and coordinating with Panzer units under Rommel's Afrika Korps. Now he bent over cotton plants in 100-degree heat, pulling weeds by hand, while American teenagers guided massive tractors across adjacent fields. The guards watched from the shade. The work was monotonous but not brutal. The food was better than anything he had eaten since 1940, and every evening, riding back to the camp in open trucks, he saw houses with electric lights, automobiles parked in driveways, shops with goods displayed in windows. This was the nation his commanders had called weak and decadent, a democracy too soft to fight. Farmers welcomed the arrangement, despite initial unease. The prisoners were disciplined, worked steadily, and caused no trouble. Some spoke English. Most learned quickly. Guards often fell asleep in the shade, and prisoners occasionally woke them to avoid getting the young Americans in trouble. The absurdity of the situation was not lost on anyone. Enemy soldiers laboring to feed the country fighting their homeland. But the wheat needed harvesting. The sugar beets needed pulling, and the war would not pause for moral discomfort. By autumn 1943, German POWs had picked fruit in Washington, harvested cranberries in Michigan, detasseled corn in Indiana, and cut tobacco in Georgia. They worked in canneries and sawmills, logging camps and processing plants. The government calculated that prisoner labor generated $7.5 million in revenue by November alone. The farms stayed solvent. The crops reached market. And across rural America, German prisoners began to understand that they had been lied to about everything. But what they saw in the fields was only the beginning. Chapter 2. The Scale. They'd never seen. Ernst Hoffmann had grown up on a farm outside Dresden. His family owned 40 acres, worked primarily by hand and horse. 2 draft horses pulled a single bottom plow. At harvest, neighbors gathered to help thresh wheat using a belt-driven separator powered by a stationary engine his father had purchased in 1936. It was considered modern equipment. The engine cost more than 2 years of farm income. In October 1944, Hoffmann stood in an Iowa cornfield watching a 16-year-old American boy guide a John Deere Model D tractor across 200 acres of harvested stubble. The machine weighed over 5,000 pounds, rode on steel wheels taller than a grown man, and pulled a 4-bottom plow that turned 8 feet of earth with each pass. The engine block alone was larger than anything Hoffmann had seen outside a tank factory. The 2-cylinder motor produced 42 horsepower at the belt and ran on distillate fuel cheaper than gasoline. The boy had been operating it since he was 12. Hoffmann asked the farm owner what such a machine cost. The answer was $2,100. A German lieutenant earned 220 Reichsmarks per month, roughly $88 at official exchange rates. The tractor represented more than 2 years of an officer's salary, and this was standard equipment on a medium-sized Midwestern farm. The owner mentioned he had purchased it used. His neighbor owned 3 newer models. Across Iowa alone, 187,000 tractors operated on farms in 1944. Nationally, more than 15 million mechanized farm machines turned American soil, harvested American crops, and fed a nation that had barely noticed its young men had gone to war. The prisoners began volunteering to operate equipment whenever farmers allowed it. German soldiers who had maintained Panzer engines understood machinery. They learned quickly. Within weeks, POWs were driving tractors, operating hay balers, and maintaining combine harvesters that cost $3,000 and could harvest 100 acres in a single day. International harvester combines moved across wheat fields like ships across an ocean of gold. Alice Chalmers tractors with rubber tires and hydraulic lifts pulled implements that would have required 20 horses in Europe. One prisoner wrote in his diary that a single American farmer with modern equipment accomplished the work of 100 German farmers. The implications settled slowly but inevitably. If American civilians owned machinery this sophisticated, what did their military possess? The prisoners had fought against American tanks, flown against American bombers, and fired at American artillery. They had assumed rough parity in industrial capacity. But American farms alone represented an industrial base that dwarfed Germany's entire agricultural sector. And these farms were not producing weapons. They were producing food while American factories produced weapons. The mathematics became impossible to ignore. Germany could not match this capacity. Germany had never possessed this capacity. The war had been lost before it began. Letters home began to change tone. Prisoners were permitted to send 1 letter and 2 postcards per month, censored by American and German authorities. Early letters had been defiant, confident of eventual victory. Now they carried doubt. One POW wrote to his brother on the Eastern Front that American farms used more fuel in a month than their entire regiment had consumed in a year. Another described seeing warehouses filled with spare tractor parts, enough to rebuild every machine twice over. The propaganda had called America soft, dependent on luxury, unable to sacrifice. But the prisoners saw a nation that had mechanized sacrifice itself, that had turned abundance into a system so efficient it required no hardship to sustain. The farmers noticed the change, German prisoners stopped singing Wehrmacht songs in the trucks. They asked questions about crop yields, equipment costs, and fuel supplies. They worked harder, as if labor could compensate for the knowledge they now carried. Some requested to stay in America after the war. Others simply stopped talking about Germany altogether. But disillusionment was only the beginning of what the prisoners would witness. Chapter 3. A Day in the Fields. Reveille sounded at 5:30 a.m. across POW camps from Texas to Maine. German prisoners rose from bunks in wooden barracks, dressed in blue denim fatigues with PW stenciled in white paint, and assembled for roll call while guards counted heads in the pre-dawn cold. Breakfast consisted of oatmeal, bread, coffee, and occasionally bacon or eggs, rations that exceeded what most had eaten in Germany since 1941. By 6:00 a.m. they boarded trucks bound for farms within a 25-mile radius of camp, 10 prisoners per vehicle with one armed guard. The arrangement was defined by necessity rather than ideology. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners could be compelled to work only if they received wages comparable to local laborers and treatment consistent with humanitarian standards. The U.S. War Department set payment at 80 cents per day in canteen coupons, redeemable for cigarettes, soap, candy, and writing materials. Farmers paid the government between 40 and 50 cents per hour per prisoner. County extension agents coordinated requests, certifying that no American labor was available and that work camps could be established safely. At an orchard near Hood River, Oregon, prisoners arrived to find rows of pear trees laden with fruit ready for harvest. The foreman explained the quota: fill wooden boxes, stack them for transport, meet the daily target of approximately 30 to 40 boxes per man, depending on conditions. Work began at 7:00 a.m. The guard, a 19-year-old private from Ohio, found shade beneath a tree and settled in with a magazine. By mid-morning, he had dozed off. This became routine across thousands of farms. Guards were often young, inexperienced, and bored. The prisoners had nowhere to escape to and little reason to try. Their uniforms made them instantly recognizable. Most camps were in remote rural areas, surrounded by miles of open farmland. Escape attempts were rare and almost always unsuccessful. The guards knew this. The prisoners knew this. On multiple documented occasions, prisoners quietly woke sleeping guards before supervisors arrived, preventing the young Americans from facing disciplinary action for dereliction of duty. At noon, farm families brought lunch: sandwiches, cold water, fruit from the previous harvest. One Oregon. Farmer's wife made coffee and donuts for the prisoners every day for 3 months. Regulations technically prohibited fraternization, but enforcement was inconsistent. The War Department worried about security breaches and public perception. Local communities worried about labor shortages. Farmers needed workers more than they needed ideology. The prisoners were polite, worked efficiently, and caused minimal trouble. By afternoon, the strangeness of the situation settled into something resembling normalcy. A prisoner who spoke broken English asked the farm owner about irrigation techniques. The farmer explained the system, asked about German agriculture, and learned that most European farms relied on rainfall and manual labor, rather than mechanized pumps and sprinkler systems. Another prisoner with mechanical training helped repair a tractor engine, diagnosing the problem faster than the local mechanic. The guard watched but did not interfere. Work ended at 5 p.m. Prisoners who met their quotas received full pay. Those who exceeded quotas sometimes received bonuses in the form of extra canteen privileges. The trucks returned them to camp, where dinner consisted of meat, potatoes, vegetables, and bread. After the meal, they could purchase items at the canteen, write censored letters home, attend educational classes, or participate in recreational activities. Some camps had organized soccer leagues. Others had libraries stocked with German language books. But every evening, the barracks doors locked at 9 p.m. Guard towers remained manned through the night. Barbed wire fences surrounded the compounds. Letters from home described bombing raids over Hamburg and Berlin, food shortages that left families hungry, and casualties mounting on the Eastern Front. Brothers were dying while the prisoners harvested American pears and ate bread with butter. The emotional dissonance became unbearable for some. Gratitude for survival mixed with guilt over comfort. relief at escaping the war mixed with shame at abandoning comrades. And beneath everything else, the dawning realization that Germany was losing not because of tactical failures, but because it had entered a war against an industrial capacity it could never match. The farms they worked were only the visible surface of that capacity. The farmers noticed the change in prisoner behavior. The singing stopped. The defiant talk of eventual German victory faded. Some prisoners asked if they could stay in America after the war. Others stopped mentioning Germany entirely. But autumn 1944 was not the end of the war. And what the prisoners were witnessing on American farms was only part of a larger story about how wars are truly won and lost. Chapter 4. Feeding the War Machine. The crisis had begun in 1942 when American farm production faced simultaneous collapse and unprecedented demand. 2 million agricultural workers had left for military service and war industries. Another million had migrated to urban centers for higher-paying factory jobs. At the same moment, the United States committed to feeding not only its own population of 130 million, but also millions of troops deployed across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific, plus allied nations dependent on American food exports through the Lend-Lease program. The mathematics were impossible. American farms needed to produce more food with fewer workers than at any time in the nation's history. The government responded with a coordinated mobilization that transformed agriculture into a strategic weapon. The U.S. Department of Agriculture launched the Victory Farm Volunteers program, recruiting high school and college students for seasonal labor during summer breaks. Between 1943 and 1945, over 3 million young Americans worked harvests instead of taking vacations. The Women's Land Army recruited urban women for agricultural work, deploying 1.5 million female laborers to farms across the country. The Bracero program brought Mexican agricultural workers across the border under temporary contracts, supplying 220,000 laborers by 1944. And prisoner of war labor filled the gaps, with 425,000 German and Italian POWs dispersed to camps near agricultural regions. By November 1943, POW labor alone had generated $7.5 million in revenue. By the end of 1944, that figure reached $22 million, with an estimated $80 million saved in prevented crop losses. Prisoners harvested cotton in Texas, picked fruit in California and Oregon, cut sugarcane in Louisiana, and processed crops in canneries from Wisconsin to Florida. They worked in lumber camps, sawmills, and food processing plants. The farms stayed operational, the quotas were met, and the logistics that would determine the war's outcome remained intact. The scale of American agricultural production during the war defied European comprehension. In 1944 alone, American farms produced 300 million bushels of wheat, 3 billion bushels of corn, 14 billion pounds of meat, and 120 billion pounds of milk. Mechanization multiplied productivity. The 15 million tractors, combines, and motorized implements operating across American farmland allowed a single farmer to accomplish the work of 50 European farmers using traditional methods. A John Deere combine could harvest 100 acres of wheat in a day. International harvester balers processed hay faster than 10 men with pitchforks. Allis-Chalmers tractors pulled plows that turned earth faster than 20 horses. This abundance fed American soldiers fighting in Normandy, supplied British civilians enduring rationing, and sustained Soviet forces on the Eastern Front through Lend-Lease shipments that included 4.5 million tons of food. American logistics won battles before they were fought. Soldiers ate 3 meals a day. Fuel trucks arrived on schedule. Ammunition stockpiles never ran dry. The industrial capacity that produced tanks and bombers also produced the food, fuel, and supplies that kept those weapons operational. Germany could not match this system. Germany had never possessed the capacity to match this system. The German High Command remained largely unaware of American agricultural mobilization. Intelligence reports focused on tank production, aircraft manufacturing, and troop movements. No one calculated the strategic advantage embedded in mechanized farming, POW labor programs, and the logistics networks that moved food from Iowa cornfields to European battlefields without interruption. By the time German prisoners working American farms understood what they were witnessing, it was too late for that knowledge to matter. The prisoners wrote letters home describing the abundance, but censors redacted details deemed militarily sensitive. Some letters reached families in Germany. Most did not. The ones that arrived were dismissed as propaganda or exaggeration. German civilians could not believe that enemy soldiers lived better as prisoners than German citizens lived as free people. The cognitive dissonance was too great, and so the information remained isolated, confined to the men who picked American crops and operated American machinery while their homeland starved. By autumn 1944, the outcome of the war had been determined not by battlefield heroics, but by the arithmetic of production. American farms fed the armies that would liberate Europe. German farms could barely feed their own population. The mathematics were written in bushels per acre, horsepower per farmer, and the mechanized advantage of a nation whose civilian infrastructure exceeded Axis military capacity. But the prisoners working those farms carried a knowledge that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They had seen the power that defeated them. And they understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the war had been lost long before the first shot was fired. The question was no longer whether Germany would lose, but what would remain when the fighting finally ended. Chapter 5. The Enemy's Perspective. Friedrich Weber arrived at Camp Algona, Iowa, in August 1944, still believing what he had been told. America was weak, its people soft and undisciplined, its democracy a chaos of competing interests that could never mobilize effectively for war. The Führer had said so. Goebbels had reinforced it through years of propaganda broadcasts. Every German soldier knew that American troops lacked the martial spirit of the Wehrmacht, that American industry was dependent on resources it no longer possessed, that American society would fracture under the pressure of total war. The first contradiction appeared at dinner on his first evening in camp. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread with butter, and coffee. Real coffee, not the ersatz substitute made from acorns and chicory that Germans had been drinking since 1942. Weber ate slowly, waiting for the portion to end, but the serving line continued until every prisoner had eaten their fill. There were second helpings, for anyone who wanted them. No one counted calories, no one rationed portions. In Germany, his family received 1,000 calories per day on official rations, supplemented by black market purchases when they could afford them. The POW camp served more food in one meal than his mother saw in 3 days. The canteen shattered the next assumption. Prisoners earned 80 cents per day in coupons, redeemable for cigarettes, candy, soap, razor blades, and writing paper. The shelves were fully stocked. Weber had not seen chocolate in 2 years. In Germany, tobacco was so scarce that cigarette butts were collected and re-rolled. Here, American guards casually discarded half-smoked cigarettes that prisoners retrieved and saved. The abundance was incomprehensible. If this was how America treated its enemies, how did it treat its own citizens? The farms provided the answer. Working in cornfields outside Fort Dodge, prisoners saw houses with electric lights in every room, automobiles parked in driveways of ordinary laborers, children wearing new clothes and shoes without holes. The farmers owned machinery worth fortunes. Their barns held reserves of grain sufficient to feed a German village for months. One prisoner wrote in his diary, now preserved in the University of Arkansas archives, that a single Iowa farm produced more food than his entire hometown in Bavaria. Another wrote to his family that American farmers ate better than German officers. The cognitive dissonance created a crisis that spread through the camps. Hardcore Nazis among the prisoners attempted to maintain ideological discipline, insisting the abundance was an illusion or that Germany would ultimately prevail through superior will. But daily exposure to American reality made those arguments increasingly hollow. How could a weak, decadent nation possess such overwhelming material superiority? How could a democracy mobilize more effectively than a dictatorship built for war? The propaganda had been specific and emphatic. Every assertion was now demonstrably false. Some prisoners retreated into silence. Others began asking questions. A few openly denounced the Nazi leadership. risking beatings from fellow POWs who still clung to the old ideology. Camp administrators documented increasing divisions between committed Nazis and disillusioned prisoners who had lost faith in the Reich. Fights broke out in barracks. Anonymous denunciations circulated. The ideological certainty that had sustained them through years of combat collapsed under the weight of observable reality. The letters home reflected this transformation. Early correspondents had been optimistic, confident of eventual German victory. By late 1944, the tone changed. Prisoners wrote cautiously, aware that censors read every word, but the doubt seeped through. One POW asked his brother on the Eastern Front whether the reports of German cities being destroyed were true. Another described American farms in detail, ending with a question. Why? Were we told this nation could not fight? A third simply wrote, everything we believed was wrong. The moral reckoning was devastating. Years of sacrifice, comrades dead, cities destroyed, families suffering, all for a cause built on lies. Some prisoners requested to remain in America after the war, preferring exile to returning to the ruins they had helped create. Others withdrew into depression, recognizing that Germany faced not just military defeat, but complete devastation. The country they had fought for no longer existed. The future they had imagined was impossible. But the war was not over. Letters from home described advancing Allied armies, relentless bombing campaigns, and shortages that had progressed from severe to catastrophic. Families faced starvation while the prisoners ate 3 meals a day in American captivity. The guilt became unbearable. Survival felt like betrayal, and the question haunted every quiet moment. What would they return to when the fighting finally stopped? The answer was becoming clearer with every passing week, and it terrified them more than any battle they had survived. Chapter 6. Fraternization and Consequences. The War Department's position was unambiguous. Army Regulation 210-60 prohibited fraternization between prisoners of war and American civilians. Guards were to maintain professional distance. Farmers were to treat POWs as laborers, nothing more. The enemy remained the enemy regardless of circumstances. Security required clear boundaries. Public opinion demanded them. Violations could result in disciplinary action, contract termination, and criminal prosecution in extreme cases. Daily proximity made enforcement impossible. A German prisoner named Hans Miller worked 6 days a week on a farm outside Houlton, Maine, for 18 months. He ate lunch provided by the farmer's wife every day. After 3 months, she began including extras: homemade pie, fresh cookies, coffee in a thermos that stayed hot through afternoon work. After 6 months, she asked about his family in Germany. He showed her photographs of his mother and sisters. She showed him photographs of her son serving with the army in France. They discovered their sons were approximately the same age, fighting on opposite sides of a war neither fully understood anymore. In Louisiana, a bookkeeper named Mary Bordelon was asked to transport German POWs from a sugarcane field back to camp when their regular transport failed to arrive. She drove 12 prisoners 20 miles in an open truck with no guard present. They sang German folk songs during the drive. She stopped at a store and bought them cold soda bottles with her own money. When questioned later about security concerns, she stated simply that they were young men far from home, working hard and causing no trouble. No charges were filed. Romantic relationships developed despite prohibitions and social taboos. In Minnesota, a farmer's daughter began leaving notes in German for a prisoner who worked her family's dairy farm. He responded in halting English. The correspondence continued for months until her father discovered it, and the prisoner was transferred to another camp. In Oregon, a widow whose husband had died at Guadalcanal befriended a German POW who helped repair her barn. Neighbors reported the relationship to authorities. She was questioned but not prosecuted. The prisoner was reassigned. Years later, she admitted she had genuinely cared for him and wondered what became of him after the war. Guards assigned to agricultural labor details often formed friendships with their prisoners. The dynamic was strange but inevitable. Young American soldiers spent months supervising the same groups of POWs, eating lunch together, working side by side in fields, sharing cigarettes during breaks. Many guards were farm boys themselves, closer in background to German rural conscripts than to American urban officers. Shared labor created shared humanity. One guard in Iowa was reprimanded for playing cards with prisoners during lunch breaks. He argued that men working together were simply men, regardless of flags. His commanding officer did not disagree, but reminded him that regulations existed for reasons beyond personal judgment. Camp administrators documented these relationships, but rarely intervened unless security was compromised. The practical reality was that agricultural production depended on cooperation, and cooperation required some level of human connection. Farmers who treated prisoners fairly got better work. Prisoners who felt respected worked harder. The system functioned because humanity persisted despite ideology. The War Department understood this, but could not officially acknowledge it without undermining the entire framework of wartime discipline. But spring 1945 brought complications. Germany surrendered on May 8th. The prisoners were no longer enemy combatants. They were defeated soldiers awaiting repatriation to a country that existed only as occupied zones controlled by foreign powers. Some prisoners had nowhere to return to. Their towns had been destroyed. Their families were missing or dead. The farmers who had employed them for 2 years asked if they could stay. The answer was no. Allied policy required repatriation. No exceptions. The farewells were quiet and strange. Farmers shook hands with men who had been enemies, thanked them for their work, and wished them luck. Farm wives packed food for train journeys back to East Coast ports where ships waited to transport prisoners across the Atlantic. Guards who had spent years supervising the same prisoners watched them leave and wondered what would happen to them in the ruins of post-war Germany. Some prisoners did return to America, immigrating legally years later after rebuilding lives in Germany first. Others disappeared into the chaos of post-war Europe and were never heard from again. The relationships that had formed across enemy lines dissolved as quickly as they had developed, leaving only memories and the uncomfortable recognition that humanity had persisted in a war designed to destroy it. But before those separations came, there was one final reckoning to be made. Chapter 7. The Arithmetic of Defeat. The last German prisoners departed American shores in July 1946, more than a year after the war's end. They boarded transport ships at East Coast ports and crossed the Atlantic toward a continent that no longer resembled the one they had left. Hamburg was rubble. Berlin was divided. Dresden had been erased. The industrial cities of the Ruhr Valley lay in ruins beneath Allied occupation. Food rations in Germany stood at 1,200 calories per day, barely enough to sustain life. Millions of displaced persons wandered through the wreckage searching for family members who would never be found. Klaus Bauer returned to a farm outside Nuremberg that no longer existed. The house had been destroyed in a bombing raid in February 1945. His father had died of starvation the following month. His mother and sisters had fled east ahead of advancing Soviet forces and disappeared into the chaos. The fields he had worked as a boy were now part of the American occupation zone, managed by military administrators who distributed food aid to prevent mass starvation. He stood in the ruins and remembered the Texas cotton field where he had first understood that Germany had lost the war long before the fighting ended. The contrast between American abundance and German devastation was absolute. While Bauer had harvested crops with John Deere tractors worth more than a German officer's 10-year salary, German farms had relied on horse-drawn plows and hand labor. While American combines processed 100 acres of wheat per day, German farmers had struggled to feed their own families. While American industrial capacity had built 300,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition, German factories had been systematically destroyed by bombing campaigns that prioritized industrial targets above all else. The mathematics that determined the war's outcome had been written not in tactical manuals, but in production statistics. American farms produced 300 million bushels of wheat in 1944. German farms produced 80 million. American industrial output exceeded the combined production of Germany, Japan, and Italy by a factor of 3 to 1. American logistics networks moved supplies from Iowa cornfields to European battlefields without interruption. German supply lines collapsed under Allied air superiority and fuel shortages that made mobility impossible. By war's end, 425,000 Axis prisoners had worked American farms, generating $22 million in revenue and preventing an estimated $80 million in crop losses. They had witnessed a system that treated agriculture as a strategic weapon, that mechanized abundance to the point where civilian infrastructure exceeded Axis military capacity. They had seen teenage boys operate machinery their own engineers could not replicate. They had eaten better as prisoners than their families ate as free citizens. And they had carried that knowledge back to a Germany that refused to believe it until confronted with the ruins. Some prisoners never returned. Approximately 5,000 German POWs remained in the United States through legal immigration after serving their required repatriation period in Germany. They married American women, purchased American farms, and built lives in the country that had defeated theirs. Hans Müller, who had worked the Maine dairy farm, returned to Germany in 1946, found nothing left of his former life, and emigrated back to America in 1951. He purchased a small farm in Wisconsin and worked it until his death in 1982. His children were American citizens who never learned German. The lessons were clear but uncomfortable. Wars are not won by valor alone. Industrial capacity, agricultural production, and logistics networks determine outcomes long before soldiers engage in combat. Germany had entered a war against a power whose civilian infrastructure exceeded German military capability. The prisoners who worked American farms understood this before their generals did. But understanding came too late to change anything. Klaus Bauer never returned to America. He rebuilt his life in post-war Germany, married, raised a family, and worked as a mechanic in a Volkswagen factory. He kept a photograph from his time in Texas, showing him standing beside a John Deere tractor, young and healthy, unaware that he was witnessing the power that would destroy his country. Years later, his son asked what he had learned from the war. Bauer answered simply, "Never fight a nation that treats its enemies better than we treated ourselves." The arithmetic of defeat was written in bushels per acre, horsepower per farmer, and the mechanized advantage of a nation that could afford to make its farmland a factory floor, while its factories built the weapons that ended the war. By the time German prisoners understood this, 60 million people were dead, Europe lay in ruins, and the world had been forever changed. The prisoners who survived carried that knowledge for the rest of their lives. Some spoke of it, others kept silent. But all of them understood that the war had been lost not on battlefields, but in the fields they had harvested, in the machines they had operated, and in the abundance they had witnessed that their homeland could never match. The war was over, but its lessons would echo through generations yet to come.